Bonjour tout le monde, merci d'être là avec nous aujourd'hui. On a des gens qui sont membres du Conseil du système alimentaire montréalais. On a des personnes qui participent au groupe de travail du Conseil SAM sur l'insécurité alimentaire. Et on a d'autres partenaires qui sont invités, mais qui sont toutes et tous impliqués dans les activités du système alimentaire à Montréal ou dans la grande région de Montréal. Donc, merci d'être là. Euh, En mai dernier, j'ai eu l'opportunité de participer à un forum à Ottawa sur le revenu de base. Et c'était un peu par hasard parce que ce n'était pas un enjeu sur lequel le Conseil SAM s'était véritablement penché auparavant. Donc, je suis un peu allée en mode, oh, bon, ça pourrait être intéressant. De toute façon, ma sœur y allait. Donc, je dis, OK, on va checker ça puis passer du temps ensemble. Et je suis vraiment repartie convaincue de la pertinence d'un revenu de base. Donc, je vais vous partager parce que j'aurais aimé qu'on refasse cet événement puis qu'on y aille tous ensemble. Mais pour pallier à ça, je vais juste faire un retour sur cet événement puis tout ce que j'ai trouvé, tout ce que j'ai pu découvrir. Donc, attends, on va revenir à ça après. Donc, lors de l'événement, on a beaucoup parlé d'une expérience de revenu de base qui a eu lieu en Ontario. Donc, il y avait un gouvernement en place, un gouvernement libéral sous la première ministre Kathleen Wynne, qui a décidé de mettre en place des projets pilotes de revenus de base dans 3 villes différentes en Ontario. Euh, et malheureusement, avec le changement du gouvernement, ben, le programme a été complètement aboli. Mais il reste qu'il y a eu un certain nombre de personnes qui ont eu accès à un revenu de base pendant à peu près 1 an et demi, si je ne m'abuse. Donc, c'était vraiment intéressant lors du forum à Ottawa parce que des participants de cette expérience étaient présents et ils ont témoigné des changements que ça a apporté dans leur vie. Euh, donc, en termes de partage d'impact, d'expérience, on a pu entendre que c'est assez évident que c'est intéressant d'avoir plus d'argent. Hein? N'importe qui serait intéressé à avoir plus d'argent. Mais ce n'était pas juste ça. Puis il y avait des impacts auxquels on serait peut-être pas pensé. Donc, il y avait l'augmentation non seulement des moyens financiers, mais aussi le temps. Le fait d'avoir plus de temps parce qu'on n'est pas en train toujours de passer tout son temps à essayer de chercher de l'argent ou à faire des économies. Donc, les gens ont vraiment nommé que cet aspect-là était quelque chose d'important. Et on va voir aussi qu'est-ce qu'ils ont décidé de faire avec leur temps. C'est vraiment inspirant. Donc oui, de retourner aux études, de prendre soin de sa famille, de faire du bénévolat, d'aider d'autres personnes qui sont dans la communauté. Euh, Évidemment, faire partie d'un programme comme ça allège le stress. Ça fait qu'on peut prendre une décision sans que l'aspect financier, l'aspect financier soit le variable prépondérant, que tout dépend de est-ce que je peux me permettre de dépenser 20 $ sur quelque chose, 50 $ sur quelque chose. Puis, il y avait aussi cette capacité de reprendre le contrôle, donc sur les décisions de sa vie, pas juste la vie quotidienne, mais aussi de dire, ben, par exemple, là, je suis dans un emploi qui est mal payé ou j'ai pas les bonnes conditions, c'est pas vraiment dans la voie de la carrière que j'aimerais avoir, mais j'ai trop de précarité pour faire autrement. Donc, je suis obligée à rester là. J'ai pas le choix que de rester là parce que l'option de changer, ça me coûte trop cher en termes de risque à cause de cette précarité-là que je vis. Donc, la capacité de faire des choix, prendre le temps de chercher un meilleur emploi, pouvoir se le permettre, retourner aux études aussi. Puis même aussi, d'avoir aussi le temps et aussi la capacité d'aller chercher d'autres ressources qui sont disponibles. C'était quelque chose qui avait été nommé que oui, il y a plein de ressources qui sont là pour aider à réorienter la carrière ou à aider avec différents aspects de sa santé physique ou mentale. Mais quand on n'a pas le choix de passer tout son temps ou à faire des horaires de travail qui ne conviennent pas, puis à gérer tout le reste, puis pas avoir la capacité de payer la garde d'enfants, par exemple, ben, on finit par pas pouvoir profiter de ces services-là parce qu'ils sont hors de notre portée à cause des problématiques financières. Euh, donc, c'est sûr que là, je viens de vous raconter le contenu de ces témoignages-là, mais je voulais prendre le temps parce que avec le Conseil SAM et dans beaucoup de milieux à Montréal, on parle de plus en plus de comme le rôle des personnes qui vivent la sécurité alimentaire dans les discussions, dans les activités de plaidoyer, dans le développement de nos projets. Et c'est pour ça que je voulais souligner qu'au forum à Ottawa, les personnes qui avaient expérimenté le revenu de base, ils n'étaient pas juste là pour témoigner de leur expérience, mais ils étaient devenus vraiment des porte-paroles de ce mouvement-là. C'était des personnes qui se sont politisées, qui ont fait des rencontres avec des élus, qui participaient vraiment au développement de la programmation aussi, puis on les voyait là comme plus qu'une personne qui avait vécu une expérience intéressante, comme si on était dans un laboratoire puis on allait les observer. Tu sais. C'était vraiment la place qu'ils ont pris dans cet événement, c'était très important et pour moi, j'ai trouvé ça inspirant comme modèle pour nous quand on veut faire plus de participation citoyenne, surtout avec des personnes qui vivent la précarité. Donc, et un des bels exemples d'engagement des participants, c'est qu'il y a une femme qui s'appelle Jessie Golem, puis elle a fait toute une série de photos et de documentation de témoignages des gens qui ont vécu cette expérience. Donc là, c'est ça. J'ai passé rapidement avant, mais on vous a donné le lien vers le site web où vous pouvez aller voir toutes les personnes pas toutes les personnes, mais un nombre important de personnes qui ont participé à l'expérimentation, puis qui ont dit qu'est-ce que ça a eu comme impact dans leur vie. Donc, ça me permet d'acheter de la nourriture qui est bon pour ma santé. Ça me permet de payer mes factures à temps. Euh, les gens racontent vraiment les autres difficultés qu'ils étaient en train de vivre pendant ce moment-là et comment cette expérience a fait une différence pour eux. Donc, on ne va pas tout passer, mais je vous encourage d'aller voir tout ça. Puis, il y a aussi un documentaire qui a été fait sur la même expérimentation. Euh, euh, c'est ça. Puis, je voulais juste mentionner que ce n'est pas la seule expérimentation qu'il y a déjà eu, mais c'est juste que je ne connais pas beaucoup les autres. Donc, peut-être la sénatrice va nous en parler un petit peu ou on pourrait s'en informer ultérieurement. Il y a eu d'autres expérimentations en Manitoba, dans les provinces atlantiques également, mais je ne vais pas m'attarder là-dessus parce que je ne m'y connais pas assez. Puis lors du forum à Ottawa, il y a aussi eu un atelier spécifique pour le revenu de base en lien avec les questions d'alimentation, donc le système alimentaire. Puis c'est clair que le lien le plus évident à faire, c'est entre le revenu de base et la problématique de l'insécurité alimentaire. Mais il y avait d'autres bénéfices ou impacts potentiels intéressants qu'on a discutés qui touchent d'autres aspects du système alimentaire. Donc, on parlait par exemple du fait que beaucoup de personnes qui sont dans la production ou des pêcheurs vivent des situations précaires et qu'un revenu de base, évidemment, serait un soutien important pour ces personnes-là. Non seulement dans le même sens d'éviter de vivre l'insécurité alimentaire, mais aussi parce que souvent, ces personnes, des personnes qui veulent pratiquer des modes de production ou de cueillette traditionnelle, donc aussi pour des communautés autochtones qui veulent conserver leur savoir-faire et continuer à maintenir leur tradition alimentaire, ils sont sous pression à cause de cette précarité. On prend par exemple des agriculteurs, de changer de mode de production, donc de passer à une production, par exemple, maraîchère, biologique, de changer pour aller dans les monocultures, d'aller vers quelque chose qui est plus à grande échelle, sous pression de l'industrie pour toujours créer plus parce que notre système actuel fait en sorte que c'est plus des gens qui vont prendre cette voie-là, qui vont pouvoir vivre de leur travail. Donc, on avait même des gens qui étaient d'autres pays, du Brésil, par exemple, qui ont témoigné que, par exemple, une bonne partie des gens qui travaillent dans la production agroécologique de maté, par exemple, qui sont sous pression de l'industrie pour changer, pour abandonner les pratiques traditionnelles, puis d'aller vers des pratiques plus avec des pesticides, puis des monocultures, etc. Et toutes ces pratiques-là qu'on veut moins voir, justement à cause de la précarité financière. Donc, ça a un impact aussi sur la capacité, encore une fois, de faire des choix plus écologiques dans les modes de production de notre alimentation également. Donc, c'est ça. Comme j'ai mentionné, on sait déjà que quand on augmente les revenus, on vit moins l'insécurité alimentaire. Il y a plein d'autres problèmes à régler dans notre système alimentaire, mais celui-là, il y a quand même des mesures assez structurantes qu'on peut voir. Puis la preuve, j'ai déjà mentionné l'évaluation du projet pilote en Ontario, mais également, on peut juste le voir avec le fait que les personnes âgées de 65 ans et plus, quand ils ont droit à des prestations plus importantes, tout à coup, commencent à être moins moins, qui vont moins vivre l'insécurité alimentaire. Donc, ça, c'est un fait qui est déjà bien documenté. Puis, là, avant de passer la parole à notre invité, je voulais juste aussi ouvrir quelques pistes de réflexion parce que dans cette discussion un peu plus large sur le système alimentaire et les revenus de base, on s'est posé des questions, par exemple, en fait, là, on donne la possibilité à des gens peut-être de sortir des emplois qui sont moins bien rémunérés et dans des conditions moins intéressantes pour faire d'autres choses. Mais beaucoup de ces emplois-là sont dans l'industrie alimentaire. Donc, quel impact est-ce que ça pourrait avoir sur les entreprises en alimentation, l'industrie alimentaire, si effectivement les gens avaient le choix de peut-être faire autre chose ou peut-être demander, exiger de meilleures conditions. Et c'est ça. Et ce qui nous amène un peu à la question, est-ce que le statu quo est éthique dans la situation où, effectivement, beaucoup de gens sur qui nous dépendons pour le fonctionnement de notre système alimentaire actuel, on peut compter sur eux parce qu'ils n'ont pas d'autre choix. Donc, je vous laisse cette question ouverte. Mais ce n'est pas moi l'experte sur la question. J'ai juste eu une belle expérience dans un forum à Ottawa que je voulais vous partager. Mais maintenant, je vais passer la parole à la sénatrice Kim Pate, qui est ici avec nous aujourd'hui. Merci, Kim, d'être là. Donc, Kim est née à Arvida. Elle est une avocate, enseignante et une femme politique ontarienne. Elle siège au Sénat du Canada depuis le 10 novembre 2016. Elle milite pour une réforme de la justice pénale et s'est particulièrement intéressée à la question de l'incarcération des femmes et des Autochtones. Puis elle va peut-être nous parler de comment ça l'a amené à parler de revenus de base. Donc, merci beaucoup d'être là avec nous, Kim. Et je sais que ça fait 30 ans que tu t'intéresses à la question de revenus de base et on a bien hâte de vous entendre.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Et je m'excuse parce que you heard that je suis née en Arvida, mais c'est parce que mon père est dans les forces armées et après ça, nous habitons en Angleterre et ensuite à la Colombie-Britannique. Alors, j'ai perdu presque tout mon français and my vocabulary and my grammar is atrocious. So I apologize. I do understand fairly well. So if you want to pose tes questions en français, j'essaie and others will help me as well. So great. Thank you very much. And very pleased to be here. A beautiful day and came on the train and from Ottawa. I live on the shores of the Kitchissippi, the unceded, unsurrendered, unreturned territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, otherwise known to most folks as Ottawa. And you may wonder how I came to this. In fact, you asked me that just as we were starting. You heard that I've worked for the better part of now nearly 5 decades. And in fact, just a day and a half ago, I was in Collins Bay Prison. Next week, I'll be in Fraser Valley in British Columbia. And I still go regularly into the prisons, and I take senators with me. Senators, members of parliament, and judges have a right of access to our penitentiary. So I have a little project I call Senators Go to Jail. Not the way some people thought they would. But but part of the reason I mentioned that is when I started going into the prisons, I went to law school to make money, not to do social justice work. I should be ashamed to say that, but I need to own it. I was trying to figure out how to exit a very working class background. I'm the first in my family to get a university education. My daughter is the second. And my 3 younger sisters didn't even have the same opportunities I did. So when I started going into the prisons, one of the things that became very clear very quickly, I started working with youth first, then as they grew up, men, predominantly men, and then I moved into working with women and girls 25 years before I was appointed, so about 35 years ago. And one of the things that became very clear, our prisons are not full of the people who pose the greatest risks to public safety. They're full of the people who are failed by every other system, and in particular, failed by our economic system, our education system, our health systems. And so we see our prisons full of, and where we see the intersections of oppression or marginalization, we see even greater. So predominantly poor people, racialized people, people who are struggling with the trauma of past abuse, people are struggling with the intersections then of that and mental health and addictions. And so it became really clear to me that, people who are committing offenses who could afford a whole team of lawyers, a team of experts, very rarely did they see jail. Very rarely did they see prosecution, let alone conviction in jail. And so I started working very early on, how do we actually diminish that inequality to try and address and build up community to try and reduce the number of people who end up falling literally through the massive, I don't say cracks, but chasms in our social, economic, and health safety nets. And so guaranteed livable income was about 30 years ago started including, and every position that we took, I was with the National Office of Elizabeth Fry at the time, and every position we took on any kind of criminal legal matter, I don't call it a justice matter because you've just heard there's no justice in my humble opinion. So every issue, we looked at the equality, the substantive equality issues. And so guaranteed livable income was part of almost every position we took, as well as a robust, more equitable tax system, as well as a more robust health system as well. And that, of course, includes food security, housing security. And I'm old enough, and I may be the oldest person here, but I remember when you would be hard pressed to find people homeless on the streets and throughout this country. This province was probably one of the last to see that eroded as well, because historically Quebec had a stronger social and economic safety net. But even, I would argue, even here, you're seeing, I don't need to tell you, you're all doing this every day. And so we started working on how do we actually build up community so that we see fewer people end up in the systems. So when I went to the Senate, it was a group of, I'd never intended to be a politician. It was anathema. It was the complete opposite of anything I thought I'd ever be doing. But when Trudeau decided it would be an independent process, I had been appearing before Senate and House of Commons committees for about 30 years when he cut loose the Senate in 2014 and 2015. And it was a group of Indigenous women that I'd been working with who approached and said, we'd like to put your name forward, because they had just read the Supreme Court of Canada decision on, because I don't know if any of you, probably nobody was paying much attention outside of Ottawa, but Harper tried to abolish the Senate. Personally, when the Senate was mostly just a rubber stamping body, I have to own, I was in favor of abolishing the Senate. I didn't see any point in us spending a ton of money on a body that was just rubber stamping what the House of Commons did. But as they read, and then they told me to read it, and I did, the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada, it became clear that historically the role of the Senate was to be much more than just a partisan rubber stamping body. In fact, it was to represent the interests, in addition to regional representation. It was supposed to be about representing the interests of those who were not represented by elected officials, either because it was seen as a minority issue, that's the term that's often used. It's seen as representing a group that doesn't get votes. Think of poor people, people in prison, you get the idea. And so a number of us who were in the first group that were appointed were very interested in that social policy and the equality, substantive equality component. And for me, it was the interest that these Indigenous women had in saying, you know, if you really want to try and do this, why don't you try doing it in the Senate, see what you can do. I didn't think there was a hope in you know what. I don't want to swear, but I didn't think there was any chance I'd be appointed because I had basically been a pain in the butt to every government, regardless of political stripe, regardless of whether it was municipal, provincial, federal, and had been pushing, and in fact had been asked to run for 3 of the parties at different times. And each time I had said, none of your policies aren't sufficiently progressive that I could get behind them. So let's not waste any your time or mine, because the first time I vote against the party, you'll kick me out anyway. So why, let's not waste time. So when it came to the Senate idea, I thought, you know, it was very nice. And really, I didn't want to insult these women who I had a ton of respect for, who wanted to put my name forward. And so, but I didn't think it would happen. So nobody was more shocked when the Prime Minister called me and said, and then what he said shocked me even more. He said, it's the activism you've demonstrated in the community, in politics, in coming before Parliament and arguing these issues that we want to see in the Senate. Now, I actually think he meant it, but I don't think he had any idea what it meant. And so the first time I voted against a budget, which is like verboten you know, you're not supposed to vote against the government period, but vote against the budget. And the reason, some of you will know, is the reason I voted against the budget is it was during the pandemic. And it was clear that even though a really laudable, as you mentioned, a really laudable effort to put the emergency benefit in place, which raised a whole bunch of people out of poverty, but it left behind, depending on which measure of the poverty line you use, at least 3.5 and as many as 5 million Canadians without any support during the pandemic. And at the same time, is this being taped? It is? Okay. So there were people in my circle, let me just put it that way. There were people in my circle who were homeless and on the street. And so the day that the budget vote came up, I just thought, I cannot in good conscience vote with this. Abstaining just seems weak. I have a quote on my wall that's in times of crisis, you know, I forget, it's the Dante quote that, you know, anyway, it basically says, you know, if you're trying to sit on a fence, you're actually on the side of the oppressor. And so I just thought, you know, I can't sit on the fence. I can't just abstain. And so I voted to amend the budget. Well, that created, anyway, I lost, but it made the point that we actually had to do something different. Up until then, I had been trying to figure out what to do about basic income. And some people I really respect, when I got appointed, I was shocked. I went, and then within 2 weeks, I thought, oh, this is a big mistake, because everybody was telling me the idea of a guaranteed livable income sounded great, but I'd sound like a crackpot to people in the Senate if I stood up and started talking about it. So my first speech was going to be on that, why we needed a robust social, economic, and health system. And instead, I, with the advice of a number of people I really respect, I said, okay, they said, start with what you know and that the rest of the Senate doesn't know about. So people in prison. So some of you will know my first speech was actually about the mass incarceration of Indigenous women in particular. And the significance of that is at that time, they were 32% of the federal prison population. They're now 50%. So I was talking about the trajectory we were on. And I, of course, wove in there all of these issues, but did it through the lens of what happens when we don't take care of missing and murdered Indigenous women? What happens when we don't take care of kids who are suffering trauma? What happens when we don't deal with homelessness and mental health and addictions and poverty and food insecurity? So, but then November 10th, when I was appointed, was actually my 57th birthday. So I was appointed on my birthday. If I don't cark it or quit before I get kicked out on my 75th. So my 60th birthday, so 3 years in, I just thought, okay, if I'm not going to speak about this now, when am I going to? So I started and launched what they call an inquiry, which is basically a mechanism within the Parliament, within Senate, to say, I'm interested in this, anybody else interested? So I launched an inquiry into guaranteed livable income. And it hadn't really gone anywhere. And then Leah Gazan, who's a First Nations member of Parliament from Winnipeg, she said she was interested in this as well. So we decided to do something that had never been done before. Since then, people have copied what we did. But we said, let's table the same legislation in each house the same day, and whichever one goes forward first will proceed with it and try and get them both through. And so we launched the bills. At the time, people thought we were a bit out there, but, or actually when I launched the inquiry, people thought we were a bit out there. It finally got to the table because you can start something, try and get it on the order paper, and it took a couple of months. Well, by the time the inquiry started and we were in the midst of writing up this legislation, it was middle of February. Well, you all know what happened 3 weeks later. So what sounded like an out there idea 3 weeks before suddenly looked prophetic. And some of you will know that during the pandemic, by the end of April, 50 senators wrote to the government, to the Prime Minister and the Deputy Minister, the Minister of Finance, and said, good for you for doing the emergency benefit, but now go the next step. You need to actually take care of the people who aren't being taken care of. And so 50 senators wrote in support of guaranteed income, and then we tabled the legislation. We're not allowed to, though, table legislation as private members, either as a member of Parliament or a senator, that's going to overtly cost the government money. So we couldn't say, just do the guaranteed livable income as much as we both wanted to, for two reasons. One, it intrudes on provincial and territorial powers. So the division of powers between the provinces and federal government are that social assistance or income supports fall within the provincial purview, except for things like employment insurance, which is how we were trying to say we could get in. And so we said, but the federal government can use its spending power and its authority to negotiate with provinces and territories and Indigenous governance bodies to negotiate a framework for developing a guaranteed livable income. So that was the legislation we introduced. When Parliament prorogued, our legislation at the Senate level was still in the Finance Committee. I'll be very blunt. It was being stalled by the Conservatives at the Finance Committee so that we wouldn't come to a vote. And unfortunately, Leah's bill got defeated in the House of Commons. And so the chances are, even if Parliament hadn't prorogued, even if we'd got it through the House, through the Senate and over to the House of Commons, it likely would have only been debated for an hour and then would have been defeated because it was basically the same legislation that had been defeated before it got to second reading in the House of Commons. So where does that leave us? Well, Parliament's prorogued, so we'll be coming back. Everything has to be retabled. Because that legislation was at the Finance Committee and hadn't been defeated in the Senate, my hope is that we can reintroduce it. The other thing we've been doing is not just relying on that, but working hard at doing public education. So that's why it's great that you've organized this. Thank you. I was speaking in Windsor and in Toronto earlier this week on this issue. I'll be speaking in British Columbia in 3 different venues next week about it. And so we're trying to get as much discussion happening. It won't surprise you that there is a ton of support for this at the local level, grassroots level, where people know how folks are struggling. a ton of support at the municipal level. In fact, that program that you talked about that occurred in Ontario, more than half of the municipalities in Ontario volunteered to be part of it. Over 400 municipalities put their hands up and said, we want to be the location for the basic income pilot. They only picked 4, but that just shows you how many municipalities. And in part it's because municipalities can't carry deficits, and so they feel it most acutely in terms of their budgets. Next week, one of the locations I'll be is Victoria. The mayor of Victoria, Mayor Alto, has been leading all of the BC municipalities have signed on, the entire group, and they're trying to get the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to take this on. And we're also working with all of the politicians to try and get them to put it in their platforms. And you may have noticed that Karina Gold, who probably will have no hope of being leader of the Liberal Party at this stage, but she took this on squarely and said, yes, we need a guaranteed livable income, and put it in. That's the first we've seen someone at that level. And even though it's been one of the #1 policies at every policy convention that the Liberals have had for almost a decade now. And we're hoping that the NDP will put it in their policy as well. The Greens already have it in their policy. And we're hoping, at one time, the Bloc was very keen, but you guys probably have a better idea than I do right now of where they are on that. I've been speaking to some of them. There's certainly a lot of them supportive. And next week, just before I head to British Columbia, we have an anti-poverty caucus meeting. And the anti-poverty caucus is a cross-chamber, so Senate and House of Commons, non-partisan caucus that includes Andriana Bloc MP is part of it. And it's co-chaired by 5 MPs from each of the parties and me from the Senate. And so we're hosting, you may have seen that the Parliamentary Budget Officer last week put out a new report basically saying that we could cut poverty by 40% if we invest net about $2.5 to $3 billion. When you know that, and cutting poverty by 40% is huge when you know that we are currently spending more than $80 billion a year in this country to keep people in poverty, not allow them to rebound out, but to keep them in poverty by, doing things that allow people to barely survive, but not to thrive and climb, rebound out. So we're hopeful. I think there's, especially now that it looks like we have a chance of not having a Conservative government. It's a non-partisan, but I'm really clear who will be really dangerous for poor people and people who are most marginalized in this country. And there's nothing in the Conservative platform that I've seen yet, and there's not much been revealed, but there's nothing even in the rhetoric that would indicate that we're likely to see much hope for people if that's the government. But we are hopeful now that it looks like there may be a move, whether it's a coalition or a minority coalition or a majority. It would be very helpful, in my humble opinion, to see a minority coalition between the Liberals and the NDP and really push for these kinds of progressive measures, because everybody is saying that they're going to address homelessness and economic inequality, but very few have actually put their minds to what kind of plan that would be. And so I think we have an opportunity to help shape that and to help push politicians to and demand that something different be done. So that's a bit about where we are. And I think, to make sure it's, if there are questions you have or suggestions, we brought the fact sheets we developed. All of the policy work that I do, predictably, a lot of work I've done is around the criminal legal area since I've been in the Senate. But one of the things I do whenever we're working on a piece of legislation, it's not just the world according to Kim Pate. None of us achieves anything alone. And so we go out and we consult with the people who have the expertise usually within the border of Canada, but sometimes we go broader than that as well. And so on this, we've had, people like Evelyn Forget, people like Dr. Zhao, who's been doing the cash transfer work in British Columbia, involved. And what we tried to do with the fact sheets that are at the back is listen to all the criticisms of basic income that were out there. You know, things like, oh, it'll create a whole community of lazy layabouts. Oh, it'll increase inflation, all of that. And we knew it wasn't true, but it's one thing for me to say that's not true. So we thought, well, let's pull together the evidence to show. And so as we've gone across the country, there's one specific to Indigenous people. There's one when we're in Prince Edward Island. There's a huge group, you may know, PEI is keen to actually be the country's demonstration initiative for this. Newfoundland and Labrador has been interested. Many municipalities in Nova Scotia also. Manitoba's keen, BC's keen. So really, there's a growing momentum amongst provincial and territorial, as well as the North. Nunavut has been interested. Northwest Territories, there's interest as well. Yukon is interested as well. And so, and here we've been told by the provincial government that they're interested in doing social assistance reform. And one of the things we're saying is that's great, but you could also do that as a demonstration with your partners in provinces and territories and talk about how do we streamline the administration of finances to free up people and resources to actually provide the services and supports on the ground that currently aren't being funded. So it's really about taking and streamlining the administration, not stripping away. Some people have said, in fact, here, one of the arguments raised by one of the academics who came before the Senate Finance Committee is to do this would mean to strip away other support programs. And if you've looked at what we're intending, that's the last thing we're intending. We're talking about streamlining the administration so that the finance piece becomes much more automatic, less of a judgment call, less of morality based, all of the things that we know happen. In fact, the last time I talked to a school of social work was at McGill here. And some of the young people, they were mostly young, there were some older, but most of them said, you know, we're going to school to be social workers. And one of them said, I just learned that the biggest employer is social services in various provinces. And there we're going to be policing people's income and morality. That's not what I'm going to school to do. I want to be able to provide the support that I'm being trained to do. So we're talking about those kinds of measures. So the fact sheets are really about providing the evidence to counter the arguments, because most of them are based on myths and stereotypes about poor people, the presumption that people choose to be poor, that they choose to be homeless, that they choose to be food insecure. And I hesitate even saying it in front of a group like you because you know better. But it's shocking to me the first time I talked in the Senate about how much people in where I live, within blocks of where I live, get for social assistance. I had senators come up to me and say, that can't be right. You said that they get $4.25 a day for food. And I said, yes, that's correct. This one senator, with others nodding around him, said, that's less than I pay for my coffee every morning. And I said, precisely. You have no idea what people are being expected to survive on. And he said, well, you can't budget that. And I said, precisely. So, one of the realities is there's a presumption that we, sometimes, I say we, sorry, I'm in a very privileged position now, but I think of myself as we, try and get across who actually is most impacted. And if you've got those kinds of myths and stereotypes about poor people, about people who are struggling on the street, you can imagine how difficult it is to get people to actually listen beyond that. So we've been trying to raise that awareness. And, after I finished talking about guaranteed income at one point in the Senate, a couple of people said, well, during the pandemic, my kid is 30-some and got the CERB check and just sat in our basement watching TV and playing video games. I said, okay, so you can't take a very privileged kid or adult who takes advantage of this situation and paint the entire population with that brush. That is not who the CERB was intended to benefit. And so In fact, it's part of why the parliamentary budget officer talked about using the census family in this last costing to say there is a way to deal with that if that's your concern. It's not the concern of most people who are poor, because just trying to figure out how to survive is their concern, not trying to figure out what you do with a 30-year-old who comes back home to when they're getting a CERB check during the pandemic. Sorry, I don't mean to make light of that. I'm not saying people didn't have challenges, but you know, that became one of the arguments that we were facing in the Senate to that. And so we've tried to address those. And if you access the fact sheets online, they're all through our website. And I'm a techno-twit, so I don't ask me exactly how to reach. Well, I can show you how to reach the website, but there's hyperlinks to all of the information, because I'm really particular about making sure we source everything. And so all of the evidence that we've used, you can go right to the root research. And so, and a lot of stuff we're doing now, we're also trying to get researchers to look at some of those issues and take them on. And so a good example is Dr. Zhao has done incredible work. She's, you may not know her name, but she's the individual behind the UBC cash transfers with Vancouver homeless folks, where they gave out $50 or $7,500 to 50 people first, and then now they're tracking 200 people. They've given $8,500 to, and it was a no strings attached money, and the only request, and it was a genuine request, was that people for $50 a month do a survey, so they'd get an extra $50 if they did the survey, and just talk about what they spent their money on. There was no judgment. There's no names attached. It doesn't mean nothing will get clawed back. And what they found is within a month, most people were housed, and within 3 months, most people were working, unless they were unable to work for a disability-related issue, or because they were caring for someone, or because they were, as you talked about, getting retraining to actually get a job in the future. And so she's tracked that, but she's the only one that I know who has tracked this, the big, you know, I call it the, you know, the pretext that we're concerned about people. You know, what are people spending on drugs and alcohol is often, you know, saying, oh, well, if you give poor people money, they'll just spend it on drugs, or homeless people money, they'll spend it on drugs and alcohol. Well, she took that on squarely, and she found even people with addictions, because they didn't screen out people who had addictions or mental health issues. And she said even people with addictions, the spending on drugs, alcohol, and cigarettes reduced when they got the cash transfers. So I don't know of any other research that has tracked that kind of spending. So it also flies in the face of the myth and the stereotype about, and the judgment about poor people as somehow frivolously spending money. I often say I wish we would track the same way, you know, some guy who gets an inheritance and a trust fund. Do we judge how they spend their money? Do we, you know, do we go after that? Do we judge that? Oh, well, I do, so I have to own it. How people, you know, it's why we're not advocating a universal basic income. Some people will ask, why aren't you advocating everybody get money? Well, it was actually a number of my colleagues who were, you know, in the finance area before, you know, and they said, do not give money to rich people, because they just know how to hide it, and they just hire people to hide it. And you know, through this, one of the interesting things is some of the senators who previously were not in favor of this, who have come on side, are some of the same senators who are interested for other reasons. So they're interested in securities law, or they're interested in offshore tax evasion. And as you know, one of them, Senator Down, who's a senator from PEI, said to me one day, he says, you know, Kim, if we could solve offshore tax evasion, we could fund all of those things you're interested in. And so I took that seriously. I went on the finance committee, and now I ask questions about, you know, where, you know, the fact that we haven't pursued any of the people named in the Pandora or the Panama Papers. Imagine billions and billions of tax dollars. Imagine what you must make to owe billions in tax dollars. And we have names. We know who these people are. and we still haven't pursued. And yet we go after the poor, individual who got a CERB payment, and, the number of people who a number of us have helped to pay back their CERB payments so they didn't get kicked off assistance is atrocious. And the fact that they are the easiest to catch, so they are the first to be pursued, not the folks who are making gazillions of dollars and paying no taxes. So, sorry, now I keep saying I'll go to questions, so I'll stop here to allow some time for whatever you want to discuss is fine with me. There's no question off limits. If I don't know, I'll tell you and we can try and figure out together how we find out that information. So thank you very much. Okay.
Merci. Thank you very much. Donc, on va faire une période de questions/discussion, parce que je vous invite aussi à partager vos réflexions sur le sujet de revenus de base. Donc, je vais passer le micro dans la salle, parce que pour l'interprétation, il faut que vous parliez dans les micros. Donc, questions, commentaires?
Challenges.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pat, for your presentation.
Just call me Kim.
Kim, I have a question. You just said it wouldn't be a universal basic income guaranteed. Would it be? It would be specific for certain people with a certain revenue. How do you guys? Think about it?
No, that's a great question. So one of the things we talked about was as well that if it was a certain amount, like the 2,000 during CERB, was determined to be a minimum amount that people needed. We said, if that's what they thought was minimum for CERB, there is no social assistance program in this country that pays anything near that, and very few even for disability that come close to it. So we said that one of the things we should look at is what the standard or the cost of living is in areas. So for instance, the North, where the cost of food is sky high, would necessarily have to be greater. So we see it as something that could be done through the tax system. The challenge there is, what about people who aren't on the tax rolls because of either political views about that, or because they don't, they don't make any money, so they don't know that they might actually get a benefit now from some of the mechanisms. And so we've been talking to Revenu Canada also about how we could set up an automatic tax filing system that would be beneficial and that would encourage people to want, because I didn't know till I was on finance that 11% of people in this country who are over 16 don't file taxes. So the fact, and that's probably because we haven't encouraged any trust in our system. So those who are untrusting, as well as those who politically don't feel the benefit are there. So they're actually trying to streamline that. And it's also a way to then invoke the federal tax or spending power to do it through the revenue stream. So we would see it as being something that would need to be negotiated, probably province by province and territory by territory. And the challenge of that, of course, is there's still an issue of how do we make sure, it's why we say guaranteed livable income, not just basic income, because a basic income, part of the reason the right wing has come on in some sectors, particularly in the States, is because a basic income can be still inadequate, and we're talking about a guaranteed livable income. So I don't know if that answers. So it would be variable, and a lot of that, I'm not trying to be purposely vague. It's just that part of that we want to leave to the negotiations that would happen and include the people who know best how we would monitor that or set it up that in a fair way.
Thank you. And I would challenge the idea of not having it universal because, recently I had a presentation of politologue, someone who studies politics, and he's in Quebec specifically, and he was saying how programs that are not universal, programs for the poor or poor programs, so programs that are not universal have a lot less support from the population and can be, left behind, as we've seen with the project in Ontario. And he was talking about universal, but obviously proportionate
Yeah.
to your income.
So that form of universality is what we're talking about, because it would be if you fell below the poverty line that you would be eligible. And so anybody, that could be because you're suddenly, I mean, the seasonal workers, it was when I was in Atlantic Canada and in Western Canada, and loggers and fishers and farmers said, well, what about us? And so we said, well, yeah, what about you? And some people were saying, we just want a living wage. And then some were saying we want EI reform. And so we said, well, if it's universally accessible, but you have to fall below a poverty line, then it would be available. It's like our health system, that it's universally accessible when you need it, is how we're trying to characterize. So that's a good reminder of us to remember to characterize it that way. So it's not $2,000 goes to every single Canadian. It's once you fall below, you're getting the money. Just like once you're sick, you get assistance. And, Evelyn Forget's research on the Mincome Project really started, you probably know this, she researched what happened in the 70s in Manitoba because she was working in a hospital in Winnipeg, and she was the economist for the hospital. And so she was tasked with trying to figure out why they were spending so much in emergency services. And so when she went and looked at it, it was mostly poor people and racialized, especially Indigenous people. And they were people who couldn't afford good, food security, were living in precarious situations, if not homeless, then pretty, on the margins. And they were using, they were coming into emergency services because they didn't have the preventative health care and dental care. And so they were ending up in emergency services. And so in Manitoba, in the Mincome Project, they showed, and in fact, the Ontario, even though it only lasted 18 months, they saw a decrease in the use of emergency medical services as well. So we know that crime rates went down in Manitoba during that time, and incarceration rates. So we need to be looking at the impact on all of those systems as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
D'autres questions, et c'est aussi possible de poser vos questions en français si Kim ne comprend pas, je traduis pour elle.
Thanks for the presentation. I think it's really amazing to see that an idea that was kind of like unthinkable about is coming like many more mainstream. I have two questions. The first one is about, so you talk about the fact that there would be like a poverty line that goes underneath, and then you get the measure. And I think lots of organization, I'm thinking about the Observatoire, there's like really good work at explaining how those measurements like miss the track. And so is there like an openness to like kind of reopen that measure and then look at it to be different? And my other question is, what are the pros and cons of having one measure to reach that minimum revenue rather than like different pieces of like benefit and tax credit that would then achieve that same objective?
That's a great question, because right now some would argue, and we talk about it in our documents, we already have an incremental type of basic income. We have the Canada Child Benefit. We have the Guaranteed Income Supplement for seniors. Some would argue, before it was clear it was going to be totally inadequate, the disability benefit may have been. And in fact, when the BC government looked at basic income, the panel they brought together were mostly, I would argue, very conservative economists, and they were already against this idea. So not a big surprise. The end report says, do it for some, but not for everybody. And they say they add, women fleeing violent relationships. And really the obvious question then is, who's left out? And so Evelyn Forget has done a really good job of articulating that as, the people who are least able to get a job, to get support, to have the support of the community are the people who are left out, and the presumption that it's their own fault, and a mistrust that people in poverty will actually spend on the right thing. So it's, I think, from my perspective, so if you were asking me, if I was in charge, which they're not going to put me in charge, but if I was in charge, I would say, yeah, let's take all of those benefit programs and let's look at what we're spending now to administer all of those, to hire, you know, a whole bunch of managers, a whole bunch of frontline people, and let's figure out what do people need in Vancouver, in Montreal, in rural Nova Scotia. What do they need to not just barely survive, but to actually be able to get a leg up and out of poverty? And let's set the standard so it's not something that keeps them stuck. You all know, I know so many people who are stuck on social assistance because if they make too much money, then they lose their pharmacare, they lose their dental care, they lose their child care subsidy. And so we have created systems that keep people stuck in poverty, don't allow them to rebound out. And so I agree. I think I agree with what you were saying, which is that we have to make the standard high enough that people can actually get out and thrive. And it's part of why, you know, during the pandemic, suddenly there was a whole new group of people, artists who were supporting, because we were relying on artists to provide, you know, entertainment and help our mental health, and yet they weren't being paid. And so, and there's been new, you know, groups based on occupations that have come forward recognizing, so farmers and fishers and others who have seasonal work have come on side as well, because they're saying this would be way better than EI. You know, if we got an income, not just 60% or 50% of our what we get, we wouldn't be then falsely inflating during other times. We could actually do the things we want to do. Same with, you know, young people I talk to who want to go to school. I mean, way back in the 70s, it was much more gendered then. There were only two groups who stay home historically in any project the world over, who stay home more when there's a basic income than before. It's those who are taking care of others. And in the 70s in Manitoba, it was predominantly women taking care of kids. So it's people taking care of kids, elderly, disabled. And it's people, and again, in the 70s, it was predominantly young men, people who want to get training to get a job that will actually allow them to either fulfill what they want to do, like Jessie Gollum, who did all the photos. She became an entrepreneur. She really wanted to develop her own business, and the basic income for 18 months allowed her to do that. And she's still managing, you know, not as well as she could have been if it had gone on for 5 years, but it allowed her to get a leg up and out of poverty. And so, so it's the people those are the people who stay home more. And presumably we want those people to have that option. And during the pandemic, I was shocked when I was looking for some folks just within the shadow of the Peace Tower at the homeless shelter I went to. There was a woman who was, well, there was more than one, but there was one that I knew who was going out every day working minimum wage job because she was working at the home where my mom was. And my mom died there during the pandemic, like so many others. I mean, again, many, many horrible realities of that. But she was only allowed to work, as you all know, at one home. So she'd gone from working at 3 different homes, minimum wage job, and she couldn't afford her apartment. Well, 90% of the communities in this country, if you're working full-time at a minimum wage job, you cannot afford to rent a 1-bedroom apartment. I mean, those are the things that are criminal that we should be screaming from the rooftops about. But because it impacts people who we then shame, we blame them for their own situation, and then we shame them. That stigma means they often don't bring it forward. And, you know, I can tell you lots of stories of people I've worked with where they had really good claims against the government, and they won't bring them. And part of it is because they don't want, you know, as one woman said to me, I don't want my neighbors to know I'm on assistance. I don't want my kids' teachers to know. Then my kids will get judged in ways. So I'm not, you know, I know that what happened to me when I was charged with welfare fraud, which was related to social assistance. And even though they were wrong, I would rather get a settlement that is less than half of what I'm entitled to and have a non-disclosure agreement than go public and have everybody know. My family, my community, you know, and this was a woman who had left an abusive relationship, ended up on social assistance. She didn't even want her family to know she was on social assistance. So I'm saying stuff you all know, but, you know, when I talk about this in the Senate chamber, people are shocked. They, why would people be ashamed of being poor? I said, well, think about the judgment you attach to someone being poor. You blame them for their own poverty. When Hugh Siegel did his book, Bootstraps Need Boots, it helped, it was great because suddenly a whole bunch of conservative thinkers could get an argument that anything I was saying was just seen as, soapboxing from, so I'm not sure if I answered fully your question, but okay.
Thank you. I'm going to speak you in French.
Okay.
Je fais partie du mouvement ATD, Quart Monde. ATD signifie agir tous pour la dignité. Je vais faire un commentaire, deux questions.
Okay.
Mon commentaire, nous menons une campagne contre les idées fausses vis-à-vis de la pauvreté. Par exemple, on croit ici, la plupart des gens disent, les gens qui ont l'aide sociale qui équivaut ici au Québec à $800 par personne, ils vivent suffisamment avec ça. De quoi ils veulent plus d'argent, c'est suffisant pour eux. Et on sait bien que nous tous, toutes, nous savons bien que les revenus, les mesures du panier de consommation équivaut à $2 000 par personne, et qu'il me semble que ça s'appelle les revenus viables devraient équivaut à $3 000 par personne pour pouvoir survivre dans cette ville à Montréal. Alors, il y a des préjugés. Ça, c'est un préjugé. Et il y a d'autres préjugés que vous avez mentionnés durant votre exposé. Et alors, mes deux questions. De quelle manière ces préjugés ont une influence sur les décideurs politiques qui empêchent ces décideurs de prendre des mesures de politique publique pour combattre vraiment et à fond l'exclusion des droits et donc la pauvreté? Donc, ça, c'est ma première question. Et la deuxième, quelle est la place du savoir d'expérience des plus pauvres à l'heure de créer ou de rédiger des plans d'action de lutte contre la pauvreté?
So I think I've got it. So what is the role of people in the community?
Non, what is the, oui, quelle est la place, quelle est la place qu'ont les plus pauvres? Les pauvres, ils sont en savoir,
Ouais.
que nous, parfois, on méconnaît. Donc, c'est savoir de quelle manière, un savoir d'expérience, ce n'est pas le savoir de la recherche, c'est le savoir d'expérience de vie. C'est savoir quelle est la place de ces savoirs quand vous, les décideurs politiques, vous prenez des décisions. Donc, ça, disons que ça, c'est ma première question et après, je vais répéter la première que je vous ai proposée.
Okay. I'm going to get you to, just because I want to make sure I've really got it.
OK.
Considering the prejudices that we may
Yeah.
have concerning poverty, what are the impact of those prejudices on decision makers when they're coming to the table and have to make a decision? And the second question is about how do you incorporate the lived experience and
The knowledge.
Yeah.
living in poverty when you're developing solutions and plans?
Yeah.
To help them.
Okay, that's, thank you. That's,
Welcome.
so to start with your second question
Okay.
first,
Mhm.
that's always been the way I worked. So I was trained as a teacher and then as a lawyer, and I used to often be told by people, you should have studied criminology to go and work in the prisons. And I actually think the benefit of not having studied in some of these areas is I don't come with a theory. The way that I have come to understand or learn about these issues is by being with, talking to people and trying to understand where they're at, what they're experiencing. So for me, it's vitally important. If what we're working on is not rooted in the lived experience, it sounds trite to say it now because everybody's talking about lived experience, but if it's not rooted in the experience of the people who are going to be most impacted by the policies, then in my view, we have no business working on it. So, I hired Jesse, who was part of the program, to then get other people who were part of the Basic Income Initiative in Ontario to help work on the legislation that we did. So So for me, it's vitally important. You can't develop policy in an area if you're not engaging with folks. But it's also vital that it's iterative. And what I mean by that is we also bring together people like Dr. Zhao. So Jessie is actually on the advisory group that I mentioned for our work, and as well as a couple of other people who have been on assistance who are less public about it. So we don't disclose all of those folks, but Jessie's quite comfortable being, because of the stigma that we just talked about. They don't necessarily want their name attached. But we see that as the starting point for this work. And then the importance of bringing in people who will work with folks who are living in those realities and challenge as well. Because we've had some, I'll give you an example, not on this issue, but I'll use an example of in the prisons. I go in and work with people who are in prison on issues like getting rid of segregation, getting rid of life sentences. And there are some times that I'll start out and people will say, forget it. We need segregation for this and this and this reason. And so then I'll say, okay, well, tell me what that reason is. And, well, for self-protection, they'll give some examples. And then we'll say, okay, well, what other way could you achieve that? So it's not that you just stay where people are in the lived experience, but you also are challenging them to open their minds to a more hopeful future as well. Does that make sense? Yeah. So yes, that's part of the work. How does that resonate with people who are in the place I am now, the Senate? Very huge challenge to get people to have any, the majority of whom have grown up, have lived incredibly privileged lives. To have them have any understanding of what it's like to not have those privileged lives. And, so one of the things we've started doing is talking about these issues in the chamber. And what inevitably happens then is afterwards, people will come and want to talk about it, but they may not ever talk publicly about, whether it's their sister who's been living on the street or their father who was homeless for a period of time, so we'll try and get people to, so we're not at the stage, I wish I could say we're at the stage where people will tap into that understanding and then use it to encourage others to think more, I say progressive, and I that sounds judgmental, and I sort of mean it judgmentally too, because, I want people to think outside of their own experience and to actually understand how privileged they are to have, like during the pandemic, a few of us argued that we tried to move a motion to also reduce our salary by at least 10% to help fund initiatives. We would have thought, like, really? We could easily afford to lose 10%. And, I'm probably one of the few people when I got to the Senate, my salary almost tripled. I had Red Circle, I'd worked in nonprofit, I didn't have a car. Yes, those were all choices, but there were choices based on the people I was working with. And as if I was going to be like 10 times more privileged than they were in a context where we're trying to work on equality work. And so, I don't think some of the, it's anyway, if you have ideas about how I can get it across to some of these folks more, I'm more than happy to, from all of you actually, because it's a real challenge. I mean, some of them will say, oh, I went and did, a night in the cold and now I understand what it's like to be homeless. And I'm thinking, really? Okay, that's nice you did that. I have said to people, like, you actually try and survive without any other source on what you get on social assistance for food for a month. You can't. And I talk about how we've created infinitely criminalizable groups, not because they are criminal intent, but we've created situations where if we monitored them, many of them could be criminalized or could be penalized at the very least because because we've made people reliant on food banks, on shelters, on all of the things that they are supposed to now claim. Like in Ontario, if you go to any other service, you're supposed to report all of that. Like imagine how many people would be cut off. you're also, if someone is deemed to have had an overpayment, you're supposed to not ever serve them at if you get funding from the social service department, you're not supposed to service those people. Imagine how many people that would leave if we actually did that. And so we're actually creating a norm that is so antisocial, I would say unethical, uncaring by those kinds of policies that's part of what we need to challenge. So I keep talking about it. I think, many of my colleagues, I think I make stuff up. They don't think it can be that challenging. So any ideas you have of how else to do it? I mean, I don't want to exploit people. So some folks have said, well, bring in a bunch of poor people. I'm not bringing in. It's like when we go into, I take the senators into prison, we meet with prisoners, but it's not a zoo tour. They don't go gawking around. They sit down with people and chat. And, I'm trying to figure out ways to do it that aren't exploitive. So any ideas you guys have, I'm happy to hear. Yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure that the question is really formulated, but I can't help but keep thinking about, so I work in housing right now, and the idea of a guaranteed livable income. I know from what I understand of what you're saying, so much is separated between the federal government and the provincial governments. And right now in Quebec, we're seeing like the biggest rental increase we've ever seen, like a suggestion. And so housing is becoming unaffordable, if not already is unaffordable. And so one of the challenges that I think I'm trying to grapple with in my mind is, I think, the stigma against the definition of affordable housing, when it's like affordability is really about, if we think about mathematics, from what I understand, it should only be 30% of your income towards your housing. But for many people, it's 50% or more. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know what capacity the Senate would have in communicating with the provinces about, like, what are they doing? What are they doing? Because it's clear that so many of them are not doing anything. I mean, Ontario, from what I understand, rents have increased 90% since 2018. And I lived in Ontario. I moved to Montreal about 5 years ago. And even I have found, like, it's incredible. So I'm curious to know, within the context of a guaranteed livable income, considering how much money goes towards housing, which then people are cutting down on their groceries because they have to pay rent. Like, does the Senate have any capacity to influence or communicate directly with the provinces to, as they're discussing this initiative, to really push and address and say, listen, you have to do something here, because the people within your provinces, sure, you're the leaders of your provinces, but everything is connected, right? Even in the way we file taxes, everything is connected. So does the Senate have any idea, or is there any possibility to address that?
Well, it's interesting. Tony Veroni, who's a new senator, who actually grew up in the projects in public housing in Toronto, is now an entrepreneur. So he's far from his roots in poverty. But he just wrote a piece about the need to really address the homelessness issue. And so the short answer is, can we do anything legislatively that would change it? Not exactly. That's why we're doing the framework legislation for basic income. But we've included, in fact, it's part of why some of the Conservatives went after us on the bill, because they claimed, I mean, some of you may have seen really outrageous claims, like we were going to require vaccine mandates and stuff, because in the preamble to the bill, we said that we needed national standards for for all of those things. And so we had it in there as a mechanism that needed to be put in place, but it was in the preamble, so it wouldn't be forced on the provinces to do it. But I agree with you. And I think one of the things we've tried to do is bring folks from Finland, Sweden, and Norway and Iceland to talk about the combination of their housing first and income support approach. Now, also, we've talked about what they've done with fossil fuels and what they did with resources. They made it a national resource so that it would benefit the entire country and populace, not just wealthy people, capitalist ventures. And so So certainly we've been doing some of that to say you can't just say income alone, drop income and forget about landlord-tenant rights, forget about restrictions, any of those things. That has to go hand in hand. And so we've done it that way, but I feel reluctant even to say it because it seems not as powerful as you or certainly I would want either. And so yes, we keep repeating it, saying that these aren't standalone, that they're interconnected, but that we have to move ahead. I mean, the biggest thing people keep saying is it's not the right time. And my response is, if it's not the right time now, when will it ever be? I mean, when half of the population is on the street, will it be in the right time then? When the income disparity is so great that, go ahead. Oh, okay. Do you want to ask all the questions and then that way I won't rabbit on and eat up the time?
It was just really quickly, I forgot to mention, like, in terms of how to get through to the people that you work with, I don't know if this will make any impact, but it's the idea of working poverty, because what I have noticed, because I have a background in social work as well, and this idea that, oh, well, people don't want to work. It's like, no, people are working. You just don't see it. And then tying it with housing, tying it with the cost of everything. That's where I think there could be maybe some potential to be like, no, this is a working poverty issue. So I don't know. I just wanted to share that.
Well, as you're passing to, the working poor, the idea that people were like within walking distance of our chamber who are on social assistance, or not, were living in shelters, but making and working full time, that did hit people. So any other examples you guys have of those, send them to us, because they're always, without it being exploitive, if there's a way to use those examples to help illustrate, that's great.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience and knowledge. A very quick comment. In my progressive circles, much of the discussion is around the model. Which model? Universal or? And I always say, well, that's strategy-wise. Let's talk about how to have a public discussion on those citizens forums. And if we want to put pressure, if we want to educate ourselves on the models and the possibilities and on improving the social safety net, well, let's do it the proper way with a lot of people, citizens forum across the province, across Canada, and that's the way to put pressure also on politicians.
Thank you for your speech and all the work you've been doing to promote this. I obviously am completely convinced already that guaranteed income is so important for alleviating poverty, but as you're talking, it's making me reflect. I'm coming from the SAM, so I'm reflecting more in the context of the food system in Quebec, like how that could have a leveraging effect on the actual food system we're creating here. And the problem that I can't really conjugate in my mind is the fact that our food system and our economy that's based a lot on exportations of food that's produced here is completely dependent on immigrant workers who are on temporary closed visas that would obviously not be eligible for this, and that are on closed visas where they work for employers that give them wages that are well below the minimum wage, that is not a living wage, and then they have to go back to their countries, and also like asylum seekers and refugee claimants that are here, and just the status of the people that are actually the most affected by poverty and like supporting the food system in the entire province. It's like, how could this program benefit them or bring a change when they're kind of out of reach of the program scope?
Well, it's interesting that both Leah and I thought it should apply to temporary foreign workers as well. Not everybody agreed. And so that would be one of the things that would be certainly being negotiated. But Rosa Galvez, who's from this province, has linked it to climate refugee issues as well. And so she's come at this from the perspective of temporary workers, as well as migrant workers, as well as climate refugee issues that are going to become increasingly an issue. So her work is probably more on point but we're we're working together as well. So thank you for raising that.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I don't know if you want, when you ask for examples, if you want to talk after or if now is a good time. Like, yeah, okay. So, and I'm a firm believer in experiential learning. I run a garden on a university campus, to make a long story short. And the garden, one of its functions has become sort of a platform. I see that there's a lot of people that want to help, that want to do good in the community. And I'll use one example. This man, let's call him Peter, came one day and says, you know, I don't know anything about gardening. I just want to pull grass. I said, you know, you need to be a member. I says, I just want to pull grass. Like, what do I need to join? Like, I just want to pull grass. And I said, fine, just come. And so he's pulling the grass. But at the same time, he starts talking with everybody who's there, who's mainly people who are food insecure, but who are just kind of hanging out and working in the garden.
So I don't want to pressure you, but I'll just let you know that we have only 3 minutes with that.
Okay.
If you can have a conversation afterwards, okay. And if I don't know, maybe we have other questions.
Okay. It's okay. I'll tell you after, I guess.
Okay.
Hi there, my name is Rachel. I work with the Montreal Food Policy Council. Have been a major fan of your work since you've been in Senate. My question is around the role of municipalities, actually. Montreal Food Policy Council has put forward multiple times to the English equivalent be the Work and Social Solidarity Ministry, the importance of guaranteed minimum income. But have you seen other examples of other municipalities using advocacy or different approaches that we can learn from here in Montreal at the municipal level? Thank you.
Sure. Well, the Victoria, where I'm going to be meeting with the mayor next week again, is probably the example that I can think of where she's actually putting it to her council. I don't know if she'll succeed, but she wants to actually put in place a program for a year and have everybody monitor what actually happens to homelessness, to addiction, to stuff. And it's a leap of faith. She's convinced I think she's right, but she's convinced that when people see the impact in just 1 year of doing, and they set out, they're not committed for forever. She's also, interestingly enough, the first mayor that I've heard of who, as a principled position, pays just a nominal amount, $100,000 to each of the First Nations on whose land Victoria sits, as an acknowledgement that this is stolen land, and acknowledgement, and gave 10 years of tax-free status to, and that's just it's the max she could do, so it's going to be renewable 10 years. So, you know, those kinds of little examples, and, you know, it sounds like some of the stuff you're about to talk about are, and that many of you are doing, are the types of examples that move, that we don't get, because she's so vocal. My guess is once she gets it done, it'll go to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and may help influence others, because the BC Federation of Municipalities is already behind her, and Prince George wants to do it there as well. So a lot of municipalities are signing on to basic income. It's the provinces that are, because they're the ones that they see they're expected to pony up the money, that are not necessarily jumping on. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
OK, merci. Donc, je pense que notre temps est écoulé. Donc, il me reste à remercier Kim pour votre participation aujourd'hui et tout le monde aussi pour d'avoir été avec nous aujourd'hui. La traduction, c'est fini, mais on a encore la salle pendant quelques temps. Donc, je vais te repasser le micro pour que tu puisses nous dire. C'est juste qu'il n'y aura pas la traduction pour ceux qui avaient des appareils, désolé. Mais Kim m'avait demandé des exemples et tu étais en train de nous partager quelque chose d'intéressant. Fait que c'est juste que là, on n'aura pas la traduction pour ceux qui voulaient l'entendre en français.
Get where I was. Yeah, so Peter started talking with people, and then at the same time he started volunteering, where some of these people were from a specific community organization in Montreal. And so he's got connected. He was invited to go there. he then started, because as he was volunteering there in the kitchen, he started seeing, like, hearing how the price of food and was prohibitive even for the community organization to do good in the community. So he started going to farms in the area, bringing food at, like 2 days old food, and bringing it and donating it. Long story short is that he did that all summer, but he came to me at the end of the summer and he said, he says, I've never done this in my life. He says, well, I passed by the garden and I thought it looked fun. And I thought, I want to know more about this place. And then he said, if you had not said yes, like, just come and pull grass, he says, I would never have gotten involved. I would never have understood what it was that these people who are here are going through with their living, and even the community organization, what they're going through to be able to help the community. So that was the story, is like experiential learning by bringing people. I understand, like, the people who lived, spend a night or a day outside, you don't experience homelessness. But at the same time, maybe a longer term, or maybe like the way you're doing, like taking people to the prisons. But this was really like immersive. I think it really helped it. And that's one story. There's been many stories over the past 7 years where people have said, I never, like students also, like I never understood these things until I came here and just talked with people, and also saying that, oh, these people like are just like me, like we could talk about anything, and there's a lot of prejudice that comes from not knowing, from ignorance. But by creating communities, people realize we're just all humans and we do have a lot in common. So that's my point.
Very well said.
Fait qu'on va arrêter d'utiliser les micros, mais si vous voulez rester un peu pour discuter, il n'y a pas de problème, de façon peut-être un peu plus informelle. Vous êtes encore les bienvenus. Juste pour les gens qui sont au Conseil SAM ou impliqués dans le groupe de travail sur l'insécurité alimentaire, la prochaine étape pour nous, c'est de préparer une proposition qui va être amenée au Conseil SAM pour que le Conseil se penche officiellement sur la question et se positionne par rapport à ça. Ça fait partie d'une série de rencontres que nous avons faites avec le groupe de travail pour parler des différents types de mesures de revenus, des différentes façons d'agir sur les problèmes structurants en lien avec l'insécurité alimentaire. Donc, on va parler de plus que le revenu de base, mais certainement, je pense qu'aujourd'hui, ça va nous amener à réfléchir à mettre ça de l'avant quand on parle de l'insécurité alimentaire et des solutions que nous proposons, sous réserve de la discussion qui aura lieu au Conseil, bien sûr, mais on a plusieurs membres du Conseil qui sont ici aujourd'hui. Donc, merci encore une fois à tout le monde d'avoir été avec nous. Erika, est-ce que j'oublie des choses?
Non, Anne-Marie, vous avez très bien travaillé.
Ça, c'est dans son contrat. Je dois dire ça. OK, donc merci beaucoup. Puis